inspirational speakers that really opened up my mind to what was out there for me and the possibilities for myself, a high school student who didn't even, like, those careers were not even in the scope of my ability to like grasp what these individuals who were coming in were even like elaborating on, and had these illustrious careers. And I was just like, I want to be that. So I think one of the things that the OHBM organization as a whole has done for me is really allowed me to get out of my comfort zone, get out of my shell. I remember in Junior 100 when Mr. Britton would call on me to go up there and deliver my elevator speech, I would be shaking. But those were the things that really allowed me to be here today as a medical student and speak to you, even though I'm still a nerve wreck. But nonetheless, it really has instilled a certain confidence in me that I wouldn't have had otherwise. So I'm really thankful to the Junior 100 program and the OHBM organization as a whole. One of the other things that I feel like it was critical is having those interpersonal skills. So like going to the gala and speaking to these really amazing individuals who had amazing careers. And the Junior 100 program really taught me how to speak to these people, make connections, build relationships, and talk yourself up, but stay humble, you know?
So I guess the first way to attack it is to say, like, just
Brother Ramon, please go on mute.
Can everybody mute their phones, please?
Well, I thought he wanted to join in on the conversation. Okay. But yeah, those were the things that the Junior 100 program taught me, besides all the fun stuff that I was involved in with the 100, like going to Georgia and going to Texas. That was all fun stuff, right? But I think it really allowed me to grow as a leader, and even in college, be able to take leadership positions to give back to my community. So in my undergrad, I was actually the chair of community service for the Dominican Students Association. And we threw this huge Harlem holiday extravaganza party that I was just like, so it was my idea kind of, but of course, every idea has to be executed with the team. So I had a lot of help from other clubs and from the OHBM organization, which really made it clear to me that this organization was gonna be something that, like, it was already in my heart, but was a big support system that would never let me down. And I even remember to this day, Rob Brown coming in his van and coming pulling up to my school and bringing all this Yankee gear and all this stuff for the kids. And it was just an amazing moment. And I think that the Harlem Holiday Extravaganza was so successful because of the OHBM organization and the support that I received. And we were able to like feed over 200 kids and give toys to over 200 kids. And it was really special moment. And part of that, and the OHBM was obviously part of that moment for me. So this organization has done so much for me. That and more, even financially. I mean, the scholarship has allowed me to be near campus and be able to indulge myself in these leadership positions without having all that financial stress that you know, I mean, now with the pandemic, it's even more pronounced. So it's a pleasure to be part of this organization, to be supported by this organization. And I recognize that. And so I try my best always to be at the front line and volunteer for whatever I can, whether that be the golf outing or the African American parade, or even at the office. I remember back, I volunteered at the office for like, I believe it was like the first 2 years of college. And I would be picking up the phone. Some of you may have heard me. So yeah, I mean, and I spoke at the gala as well. That was nerve-wracking, but that was a special moment for me, that I really thank the OHBM for giving me that opportunity. And now I am in my second year of medical school. I am studying for the Step 1 exam. I'm not sure if some of you may be familiar with it, but it's an 8-hour exam. It's a licensing exam. It's my very first licensing exam. And I'll be taking that in May. So I'm mentally preparing for that, as well as academically preparing for that. And I'm trying to make the best of the situation that we have now with quarantine. I'm tutoring students actively, and I'm mentoring high school students, because I remember how important that was for me. And just preparing myself for when normal times actually do arrive, and keeping myself mentally healthy. But yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Gatorly. It's always inspiring to hear you speak. And I know that you're going to go far, but I thought that it made a whole lot of sense since we were going to have this topic around health and wellness for the members of the organization, especially those who are not familiar with our June 100 program or may not have seen you, to see some of the products of the work that some of the members of this organization are putting in to that organization, so that we can be a part of your success. So I hope that you continue to remember us. We'll always continue to remember you and try and be as supportive as possible in your future endeavors. So thank you very much, Gatorly.
Thank you, and thank you all for all of your support throughout all these years.
I now want to turn it over to Dr. Reginald Miller, who will introduce Dr. Michael Lindsay. Dr. Miller.
Thank you, Dr. President Ennis. So brothers, it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker for this evening. I'm Reg Miller, one of the members of the Health and Wellness Committee. And in addition to our fireside chats, I hope that you all have been taking part in, we've also talked about, as a part of our mission, to continue educating our members around issues of health that are impacting our communities, as well as impacting our members. So in that vein, I'd like to introduce one of our own, Dr. Michael Lindsay. Dr. Lindsay is the Executive Director of the McSilver Institute for Poverty Policy and Research. He's a Constant and Martin Silver Professor of Poverty Studies at the NYU Silver School of Social Work, and he's an Aspen Fellow. In his work, Dr. Lindsay has also participated in congressional reports, specifically working with the Congressional Black Caucus on issues around suicide and adverse impacts to youth. So in that vein, Dr. Lindsay's talk tonight is titled, "Dying to Ask for Help, Suicide Trends and Treatment Disparities Among U.S. Adolescents." Dr. Lindsay.
Great. Brother Miller, is it okay if I share my screen? Let's see. All right. Greetings, brothers. First of all, I just want to say thank you to this brotherhood and for the tremendous work that you do to touch lives. I'm going to start off by sharing with you a young man named Ryland Ty Hagan. Ryland is 11 years old and is from Washington, D.C., which is my hometown. He lives with his mom, and in recent years, reconnected with his dad, who's been incarcerated for most of Ryland's life. He's a star football player and basketball player. He's the only child, and by his mom's report, he is her heartbeat. Her world revolves around Ryland. And on the afternoon of November 20th, 2017, Ryland's mom returned home from running errands. She has a bag of groceries and can barely manage to get up the steps to their modest apartment because her arms are full. She eventually enters the apartment and calls out for Ryland. Ryland, where are you? These bags are heavy. Dropping the bag, she's thinking Ryland's not home. But that's not possible because she had just talked to him 2 hours before, forewarning him that she was going to need help with the bags of groceries when she returned home. Walking past the kitchen, she heads toward his room, calling his name again, Ryland. Still no response. She enters his room and discovers the unimaginable. Ryland is hanging from his bunk bed. His school belt, made into a noose, is wrapped around his neck. In the conversation I had with his mom, she says to me, "Dr. Lindsay, you can share my story. You can share the story of Rylan wherever you go. But please help me to understand, why did my son hang himself? Why did I find my son hanging? Brothers and sister who's joined us, I can tell you that all around the country, in talks I give, in congressional hearings on Capitol Hill, my earnest desire and interest is to help Rylan's mom understand why she found her son hanging. I think about that conversation with her, and I think about Rylan almost every day of my life. Rylan's not by himself. Carl Joseph Walker Hoover, 11 years old in 2009, took his life, unfortunately, after teammates on the football team called him gay. Gabriel Tay was 8 years old from Cincinnati, Ohio. There's video footage of him being bullied at school. And it took about 10 minutes or so for school personnel to respond. He was sent back to school a couple of days later and again victimized. And so later on that afternoon, when he went home from school, his mother came home to find him hanging from his bed. Seven Bridges, I actually had an opportunity to extensively interview and come to know his mom from Louisville, Kentucky. In January of 2019, he died by suicide, also by hanging from his door in his room. The irony in Seven Bridges' case is that his mom is actually a mental health advocate and goes around the city of Louisville and throughout Kentucky, extolling the virtues of getting mental health treatment. And somehow or another, she was not able to reach her son in a way to disrupt his path toward dying by suicide. You know, it seems like these kids are dying, as is noted in my title, to ask for help. And let me just say this. If this phenomenon was happening among white kids in this country, and heretofore it had been a Black phenomenon, you'd hear about this crisis. There would be all kinds of federal responses, new agencies developed to try to address this issue. What I have here is a chart that shows that from 1993 to 2012, the latest year for which this particular study examined data, you'll see that for 5 to 11-year-old kids in the United States, that there is an upward trajectory of death by suicide for Black kids. And the next highest group is white kids, and you see that their trajectory is going downward. So now it is the case that Black kids are 2.5 times more likely to die by suicide in the 5 to 11-year-old age group than the next highest group, which are white kids. That same group re-examined their data in 2018 and looked at 2001 through 2015 and looked at the 5 to 12-year-old Black children, or children throughout the country, but Black children in particular were found to have a significantly higher incidence of suicide than white children. So in the previous study, they thought it was just a Black boy phenomenon and discovered that it's Black children, generally speaking, 2.5 times more likely to die by suicide than their white counterparts, which is the next highest group. I conducted a study that came out in the journal Pediatrics last November of 2019. I looked at trends in suicide behavior among high school age youth in the United States from 1991 through 2017. So this is only for high school age youth. What I found, generally speaking, is that about 18% of kids over that span of time are actually thinking about suicide. So that's 1 in 5 kids. Another almost 15% of kids had a suicide plan, 1 in 10. What I was interested in was looking at these data to uncover whether there was any trends related to racial and gender differences over that span of time. So I looked at 4 indices of suicide behaviors. I looked at thinking about suicide, planning suicide, attempting suicide, and having an injury related to a suicide attempt. What I found is that for the category of thinking about suicide and having a suicide plan for all youth over the span of 1991 through 2017, the trends are going downward. When I got to the suicide attempt category, I discovered the unimaginable. Every ethnic and racial group saw a decrease in suicide attempts over that span of time, except for one group, Black youth. Over that span of time, their suicide attempts increased by 73%, while every other racial and ethnic group saw a decrease in suicide attempts over that span of time. Let me repeat that, 73% increase in suicide attempts among Black youth, while every other racial and ethnic group saw a downward trend. I don't show here, but in the category of having an injury related to a suicide attempt, Black boys, high school age boys, were the only group out of everyone else that saw an increase in having an injury related to a suicide attempt over that span of time. And that percentage increase was 122% increase. I recently analyzed data from 1991 through 2019, 2019 being the latest year for which the CDC data was available. And I saw that the 73% increase got wiped out, and it's now over 100% increase in suicide attempts for Black youth. Again, the only group for which there is an increase in suicide attempts. But I want to point out something that's even more alarming, that my data, and I began to uncover from other studies, is showing a pattern of. And that is, are Black kids going right to an attempt without even thinking about suicide or planning suicide, or having any psychiatric risk factors associated with suicide? And what I mean by that is depression, anxiety, the common factors that are typically associated with suicide behaviors. And so to uncover and unpack this, my team, we applied this, what we call an ideation to action framework. And it's a fairly new phenomena in suicide research, where you look at whether thinking about suicide, planning suicide, and then attempting suicide takes a sort of progressive next step, right? And so you would imagine then, if you're thinking about suicide, then you're likely to plan a suicide. If you're planning a suicide, you're likely to attempt a suicide. So that's what this framework helps us to address. What's novel about this framework is that oftentimes when we look at people who engage in suicide behavior, particularly for youth, we compare them to non-suicidal youth. So this is the first time, or among the first studies, that's actually looking within the group of youth who are actually exhibiting suicide behavior, if that makes sense. So the groups broke down into 4 categories in terms of our results. This was data based on about 7,000 kids. So there's a group 1 who had suicidal thoughts only. Group 2 had suicidal thoughts and plans. Group 3 had suicidal thoughts, plans, and attempts. And group 4 only had an attempt. That was about 262 kids. So that's the smallest group in the sample. Most of the sample was white, mostly female, and most kids were between the ages of 15 and 17 years old. What this chart basically suggests, my brothers and the sister who was on the call, is that Black youth, relative to white youth, who is the comparison group, actually do have an attempt only, rather than thinking about suicide only, or having suicide thoughts and plans, or even having suicide thoughts and plans and an attempt. So Black kids are the only group that are showing a statistically significant relationship in terms of having a suicide attempt only. They're over 3 times more likely than white youth to attempt suicide as opposed to thinking about suicide only. And over 3 times more likely to have an attempt only rather than to have thoughts and plans like white youth have. This is really, really alarming that Black kids, when they engage in suicide behaviors, go right to an attempt. And this is nationally representative data that I just showed you. So why is this happening? I'm going to point to some of my prior research for some plausible explanations, but I got to tell you all, we're still trying to unpack this and uncover why is this happening. So these are plausible explanations, but we really don't know why we're seeing this trend both in the younger age kids as well as in the high school age kids within the Black race. So the first thing I'll point to as a factor is the lack of mental health treatment. Oftentimes there's misinterpretation of the behaviors of our Black kids. There's limited support in the family for mental health treatment. And then we don't go to community or school-based treatment. And I'm going to show you this in a couple of studies I have, or some of my writing. And by the way, if you're interested in any of this, any of the studies, all of this is written up and I can share them with you. A few years ago, when that study came out about Black boys dying at higher rates than white kids related to engagement in suicide behaviors, I wrote this paper along with some colleagues called Boys Don't Cry. And you can see the parenthetical note with the NT, a play on words suggesting that boys do cry, but we don't hear them. We don't listen to them. We don't interpret their cries for help with outreach and the requisite support that they need. What we do in the grander scheme of things is we feed boys, Black boys, toxic messages. Man up, fight it off, be tough. I've done it to my nephews, my little cousins. I had it done to me, and no doubt you all have had it done to you. Man up, fight it off, be tough, no matter what you're going through, even now. You know, if you're going through a tough time at work, fight it off, man up. Those are toxic messages because what they do is they blunt our range of emotional expression. They don't give us space and agency to emote, to cry, to acknowledge we're in pain and we need help. If we start socializing boys in that way at very early ages, they grow up without the opportunity to share their pain. When I talked to Ryland's mom, I probed that with her and I said, did you ever say to him, You know, don't cry, tough it out. She said, yeah, I used to say that to him all the time, telling him to be tough because they were going through financial strains, or he was upset about his father not being around. And she used to tell him, I'm your father, be tough, boy, you know, grind it out, it's gonna be all right. We also find that boys tend to externalize their behaviors. I once had a kid who I interviewed for a study, a Black kid who was very depressed, off the charts depressed. And I asked him, when you're sat down, what do you do about that? You know what he told me? He said, I want to go and knock somebody's head off because I want them to feel the same pain that I feel. A 16-year-old Black boy told me that. So we externalize our struggles or behaviors in ways that mask our anger or that mask our pain. You know, whether it's related to your father not being around or whatever the case may be. And so then when we externalize those behaviors, and I'll come back to this in a second, and we fight or we become assaultive or aggressive in any way, what happens? We get kicked out of schools. We get arrested. You know, we have unfortunate interactions with law enforcement. I also completed a study of about 465 ninth grade students in Baltimore City when I was on faculty at the University of Maryland. And what we found is that out of those 465 Black students, half of the sample had identified mental health needs, and only 20% of them received mental health treatment. And in almost 100% of the case, those kids had mental health services in the schools that they were not reaching out to or were not impacted by. For the kids who actually did reach treatment, they reported to have family support for their emotional and psychological struggles. The kids who did not reach treatment reported to have lower levels of family support. Completed another study of about 1,600 Black adolescents in Philadelphia. And these were kids who were accessing the Psychiatric Emergency Services Center at the University of Pennsylvania. Again, I discovered something that blew me away. Now, these are kids who are going to a psychiatric emergency services setting, right? 73% of those kids arrived voluntarily, and their arrival was associated with a non-urgent reason. They didn't need to go or didn't need to be in a psychiatric services setting. What I discovered in terms of just trying to figure out this data, these findings, and trying to interpret what was happening, is that what we do in our community is that we either don't know where to go for community-based treatment, we ignore the problems until they get really bad or emergent, like we want to go and knock somebody's head off. And then what happened is when that problem emerged, in this case, those Black kids were going to the Psychiatric Emergency Services Center when they didn't need to be there. So they're accessing those services directly related to not going to community-based treatment. A lot of that could be related to stigma or the availability of services, the whole nine. And so these are factors related to the lack of treatment that I think are plausible explanations for why we're seeing higher and higher rates of engagement in suicide behaviors. Factor two, what happens in schools, and this is based on nationally representative data. Black kids relative to white kids are likely to be overrepresented in terms of disproportionately being disciplined. Boys are over-disciplined, overrepresented there. Kids with disabilities, overrepresented in terms of school discipline. This is a national problem. And we see here that it affects Black kids. A colleague of mine did a study, she's now at Duke, but used to be at NYU, and looked at the time of the month when kids exhibited the most behavioral problems. And then she looked at whether the family had SNAP benefits or food stamps. What she discovered was that income instability predicted the students being expelled or suspended, and that the spikes in disciplinary problems at the end of the month was directly related to these kids running out of food stamps. So in other words, these kids were showing up to school hungry, perhaps malnourished, and acting out. When perhaps if they had sufficient food and nourishment, they may not have been acting out in that way. Those kids are likely to be suspended. And we're totally not looking at that. And then we know about public education and the prison industrial complex and the fact that over suspensions and expulsions from schools lead to Black kids and brown kids being disproportionately involved in juvenile detention. And I just received a study today that I'm going to read based on data in North Carolina. These folks found that the extent to which kids are being suspended, Black men were being suspended from school, is directly related to later involvement in prison in terms of being incarcerated. So Brother Miller acknowledged some of the policy work that we've been doing in relation to this issue about Black youth suicide. We've been working with Congresswoman Bonnie Watson Coleman. I chaired a working group that supported an emergency task force convened by the Congressional Black Caucus. In April of 2019, we launched this emergency task force and our working group. Members of the emergency task force included these folks here. Bonnie Watson Coleman was the chair. The late, great John Lewis was a part of this emergency task force. And again, I worked on or led a working group that produced a report that these members asked us to develop so that they can begin to take a legislative path toward addressing this Black youth suicide issue. And each of these members expressed their pain, their concern, because they didn't know that this was happening until we brought it to their attention. And so last December of 2019, from April to December of last year, we worked really hard to produce this Ring the Alarm report, the crisis of Black youth suicide in America. And at the same time, Congresswoman Bonnie Watson Coleman sponsored a bill that is related to the findings in this report. And that bill is called the Pursuing Equity in Mental Health Act of 2020. And I'm pleased to announce that in September, the House of Representatives passed this bill, Pursuing Equity in Mental Health Act of 2020, to directly address the Black youth suicide issue in the United States. This bill calls for the provision of $805 million to address this issue in a number of ways. Putting more school mental health professionals in schools across the country that are predominantly occupied by Black youth. Doing more educational campaigns in the Black community to bring greater attention to this issue. A Senate version of this bill is being sponsored actually now by Bob Menendez and Cory Booker and another senator from Nevada. I'm blanking on her name right now, but they are all sponsoring the Senate version of this bill. We're keeping our fingers crossed that this bill gets passed in the Senate and hopefully signed by whomever is our next president. We've also been working at the McSilver Institute on this issue in the state. Senator David Carlucci and Assemblymember Kimberly Jean-Pierre last year in both houses in the state passed bills to establish a Black youth task force to focus on this issue of youth suicide behaviors. What I didn't say here, and I'll say now, is that the New York State data from 1991 through 2017 mirrors what we see at the United States level, in that Black youth are the only group that's showing an increase in suicide attempts relative to other groups in New York State. And so now we're working with Commissioner Ann Sullivan on a Black youth suicide work group. We convened this summer and we just finished up some recommendations that we are submitting to Commissioner Sullivan for implementation in New York State. So we're really proud about that, and didn't ignore this issue in terms of what's happening in our own backyard, if you will. I just want to close by bringing your attention to a podcast series that we have convened at the McSilver Institute called Changing the Narrative, Black Men and Boys. This is the second season of it. It's hosted by McSilver Institute's Chief Operating Officer. You may know her, Rose Pierre-Louis, from her days as the Deputy Borough President of Manhattan, and also the former Commissioner for Domestic Violence for New York City. Rose did a phenomenal job interviewing thought leaders on a range of issues related to the circumstance of Black men and boys. And so I encourage you to check that out at your leisure. So thank you, and I'll open it up for questions or comments if we have time for that.
Dr. Lindsay, I'll jump in there. Good to see you, sir. Pleasure to work with you with the Health and Wellness Committee. My name is Reggie Pittman. I was calling, I wanted to ask you like two things. One, as a father and a mentor, but primarily as a father, I would say that a lot of us, probably over 35, had fathers that were tough, right? You know, they would say, man up, don't cry, all that stuff. I mean, I know I can speak for myself that my father was very tough on me. And I appreciate it because it made me be able to handle a lot of stuff when I got out into the world. But my sons and the mentors and students that I teach don't seem to be, you know, it's a different world now. So what happens is, you know, children of a lot of us grow up in a nicer area, and it's a different type mindset instead of the inner city. And we might not be able to do the same things. So as a father and as a mentor, but mainly as a father, how do we retrain fathers to not be as hard on our sons as probably our fathers were? That's one. The other thing is the whole cyberbullying thing is a whole new thing, which we didn't have to deal with before. So you can be home and still be bullied, which is a new concept. You know, usually when you go home, you're safe, you know, for the most part. But now you can have your cell phone and people can still mess with you. So how do we retrain fathers as far as the message that we send to our young boys? And if they're living in a better area, you know, the family's doing better financially. And also the cyberbullying, what's the attack of that?
Brother Reggie Pittman, thank you for that question. I too was raised by a single mother, but older brothers that were tough as nails, who didn't take anything like, you know, you getting bullied, go back out there and fight until you scratch and claw and whatever you got to do to win. I do think that a number of things are happening. I think kids are more knowledgeable about mental health issues these days. I think our society is more knowledgeable about them. And so kids are, by the way, the data that we presented or that I presented from the study I conducted is all self-report data. So these are kids acknowledging, that they have engaged in suicide behavior, right? And so I think that, some of what's happening is that, kids are more knowledgeable and it makes them more sensitized to these issues. And so I think then that we have to recalibrate, and understand that there are more sensitivities involved. And I think, move away or shift from the kind of parenting that we had. It's a new context because, these kids are exploring more, engaging in more, things than we ever imagined. And so we don't want to push them to the point of thinking about or contemplating self-harm, right? And so I think we have to step off the pedal a bit. And so let me give you a quick anecdote. I don't want to be long-winded on this, but I feel like, we got to be talking about this issue in our community. How many brothers actually knew that this was a phenomenon happening among Black youth in this country? Only a few, right? And so I think, we have to give space to this. But what I was going to say is that last December, just as we was putting out the report, I must have done an interview somewhere, and these two parents called me from a school in Detroit. I didn't know that they knew each other, but they said they wanted to talk to me about my suicide work. And so they said that there were some things happening in their schools they were concerned about. I just had this inclination, let me put them on the same phone call since they're, calling from this school in Detroit. And what they told me was that they were concerned about their sons because there were 3 kids in this school in Detroit last fall who actually died by suicide. 3 Black boys. And they were afraid for their sons. And what was crazy is that the family, the 2 parents didn't even know each other. They independently contacted me. So then I said, well, let's get a whole bunch of parents. Let's do a call in a couple of days. Let's get a whole bunch of parents on the call. And about 4 Black men joined the call. One was a judge, and he was calling on the call from his chambers. And he said, yeah, I have 2 sons at that school, and I'm concerned about what's happening. And, should we step off the pedals? Because, similar to your point, Brother Pittman, they said we were raised to, tough it out. And I said to them, yes, until we find out what's really going on and can get to some answers, back off these kids, love them, and approach them in a different sort of way, and converse with them and understand what is paining them, and get them to talk about it. In terms of the cyberbullying piece, we don't know yet that cyberbullying leads to engagement in suicide behaviors. We're still trying to document that. What we do know is that girls, and particularly Black girls, tend to spend a lot of more time on social media and are more likely to be victimized as it relates to their participation or use of social media. And that might be related to why in our data, we saw that the increase in suicide attempts was actually happening faster for Black girls than they were for boys. And so I think we need to pay attention to that. And as we developed the report, the Congress members were really keen on convenings. And we actually had a convening on cyberbullying, and we didn't reach any definitive conclusions, right? Is social media an issue for the rising rates? And we didn't reach any definitive conclusions, nor is there data to substantially support that. So, one of the things we want to do in terms of getting more resources to do the research is to begin to investigate that and try to uncover what's happening. it could be, the rising trends could be related to, Black kids and all of us seeing more people of color, particularly Black men, die at the hands of law enforcement. So being traumatized could play a huge role, but we don't really know that yet. And so I always sort of suspend, that kind of speculation until I can document it from a research perspective.
Hey, Dr. Lindsay, it's
Oh, yeah.
Rob Brown. Quick question, and Reggie, I thought tried to touch on this. Do you see a difference in the numbers between urban and suburban kids? Is there a distinction there?
No, there is no urban suburban distinction, nor is there any socioeconomic distinction. This is happening among Black kids, generally speaking. Certainly there are different nuances related to whether you're poverty impacted, or as in the school in Detroit, that was actually a private school. And most of the parents were saying that they were guilty of putting a lot of pressure on their sons to be just as good as the white kids in that school. And maybe it was that pressure that took a couple of those kids over the edge.
Okay, Brother Lindsay, thank you for this talk. I really appreciate it. And you don't hear people talk about this, and it's really, really important. I'll make one anecdote and then lead into my question. So I know some of the other brothers may experience this too growing up, but it wasn't my father so much that was really tough on me, but it was my brothers. And remember this one, if you lose the fight, you're gonna get it again when you get home. Your brother's gonna beat you. You know what I'm saying? Like, you gotta go win that fight out there, because when you get home, you're gonna get it. Your brother, you're gonna get a second beating. You know what I mean? So you gotta handle that. Just put that out there to talk about the pressure, and it's not always the father, it's some of the uncles and the brothers and whatever. This is so relevant to me because I was watching a program the other day about bullying, and I realized I never really asked my 10-year-old son. I have a 10-year-old and a 19-year-old son, and then a daughter who's 17. But I asked him, were you ever bullied? And we had a little talk, and he said, no, it's ever happened. And I told him, let me know, whatever. So that leads into my question as to, based on the data that you have or whatever, have you put together some type of a pamphlet or some short piece of data that you can hand people to say, if you see these things, this is probably a person that, somebody should talk to before it leads to something bad? And I say that because I'm involved with a diversity innovations hub at Mount Sinai. Reg Miller knows about that. He and I will work together on some other things. And these are the type of disparities and things we're looking at to find out, what can we do to arm our community with the data to recognize and address some of these things. And I'm thinking, I'm working with another organization. I actually spoke to President Aldrin about collecting the data and doing some metrics and analytics, and doing some reporting about data that we get from different areas in our communities. But do you have enough, at least preliminarily, that somebody can be handed this thing and say, well, if you see these 4 or 5 things, that might be a person that, we need to get them in front of someone that they can talk to and help mitigate a problem before it arrives?
Yes, the short answer is yes, and I'm going to put my email. So Daryl, sorry about that. I thought I was chatting with everyone. I will answer your question, Daryl, but I'm going to put my email in the chat so that you have it. And for those who need, I have infographics that we have developed. Some of them are related to COVID and mental health. And some of them are related to Black kids and how they express their frustrations or pain or whatever the case may be, related to their emotional and psychological well-being. And so, yeah, I can share that with you.
So brothers, I don't know how many more questions we have. We're getting close to the meeting. Brother Knox has been trying to ask a question for a few moments.
Yeah, Dr. Lindsay, nice listening to your presentation. I just have one question in trying to understand when you look at someone who has long-term mental challenges, and we would say that they're having some mental issues, and then you see these people who go through these sort of momentary crisis or trauma that may consider suicide as the answer at that particular point. How do you look at that when you look at someone that you say, okay, well, they got beat up today, they got bullied the last 2 days, and they hung themselves, as opposed to someone we have seen with mental illness over time, and we just know that they are coping with that. Are there signs that lead up to that, or is suicide sometime just can be defined that it's a solution in somebody's head at a moment of crisis or a moment of trauma?
Well, the last thing that I presented on this ideation to action framework actually scares, excuse my language, the shit out of me, because it suggests that Black kids are going right to an attempt, right? There are other studies that have documented that Black kids who attempted suicide had no psychiatric risk, right? They weren't endorsing depression or anxiety or whatever the case may be, right? And that was a nationally representative study. I have a colleague in Chicago who shared with me that she did a study on on girls, looking at Black and white girls, and the white girls actually had suicide ideation associated with higher rates of depression. The Black girls had suicide ideation, and it was unrelated to depression. So we have to unpack and try to figure out, why is it that Black kids are endorsing or engaging in suicide behavior and you don't see any of the common warning signs, right? So I wish I could tell you that there was some kind of distinction or distinctive behavior from someone who's persistently struggling with a mental illness versus, you know, a more acute or I won't, you know, I don't want to say that it's an impulsive behavior. In fact, I just read a study that suggested that suicide attempts are not necessarily an impulsive behavior. There's more to it than we think. We just have to unpack what it is, right? So, I mean, I wish I had better news about that, which is why, you know, this case was made before the House of Representatives in Congress, and it passed, you know, because there was a compelling argument made by the sponsoring congressional members that we need to do something about this and hurry, right? We're also talking with NIH. We're trying to get CDC involved, SAMHSA, all of the major players in this country that have institutes that focus on behavioral health, so we can get, in a rapid way, the resources to be able to do the work to unpack what's going on. And again, I tell you, brothers, if this was a phenomenon in the white community, there would be an outcry. Everybody on this call would know about it. And the fact that we have to, you know, ring the alarm and scare people half to death in order for something to be done is like, it's a dehumanization of our Black bodies.
So brothers,
Brother Lindsay,
brothers,
I have.
I'm sorry, brothers. President's telling me we got to wrap this session up. I appreciate the enthusiasm around the topic, but we have another report that we have to get to. Can I ask you all, and again, I apologize, can I ask you all who have questions that haven't been addressed to put your question in the chat? We can forward that question to Dr. Lindsay, and he can respond to your question. So President, and so first of all, let's thank Dr. Lindsay for an excellent presentation.
Thank you.
Maybe we'll have him back and talk about this topic further, because this is something we definitely need to drill down on. It's affecting our community. And Brother Ennis, I'll turn the meeting back over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Lindsay, for that phenomenal presentation. And you know, as Dr. Miller stated, you can see the enthusiasm behind it. and the knowledge that folks are looking to soak up on this topic that has plagued Black folks for quite some time. But I want to move the meeting along and be respectful of everyone's time. Courtney, can you take it from here, please?
Sure. I also want to thank Dr. Lindsay. Health is so important, and we're going to use this to build on our health agenda. We want to now move to our gala. Lots of planning's going on, and Rob Brown's on the phone. He's the chair of that committee, and he's been very active in his leadership. We thank him for that. Rob, can you let us know, the members know what's going on?
How's everybody doing out there? So